It was a brief description of how it started. Really, Colin McAllister, who was the singer with the band I played in Setanta, had been telling me stories about in Antrim. He knew quite a few dulcimer players there would come out after the dance had finished at night time. They would set up tables and put dulcimers on them and play. And at that time, we were playing quite a lot in Glasgow and Lanarkshire area. And there were quite a few occasions when people approached me and said, "Oh, my father played, or my grandfather played, or I've got one of them under the bed, but I don't know what to do with it." Sort of thing. And Colin had the idea that we should set up a group and find out a bit more about the history of it. On the day when we had the first meeting in the People's Palace, there was about 25 people. 8 of them were dulcimer players, so we were amazed, and they were really keen to get together and play, because all of them thought they were the only ones still playing, and they never heard of anybody else playing the dulcimer. So that was the dulcimer group began. So I'll give a wee bit about some of the original members. Willie Burke, I'll play a wee track of Willie, and you can have a wee read it, what he was about. Yeah, so Willie was a player. He was, I think, maybe 85 when he was in the dulcimer group, but he had been playing since he was a young boy. And he told me about if he was playing with melodeons, he'd sometimes just vamp, and if he didn't know the tune. He also, told us a few stories about McNally and different people. And his nephew, John Crichton, had learned from Willie, and he's another really good player, which I'll let you hear a bit of. That gives you another idea of the kind of stuff that they were playing. Another one, Jimmy MacDonald. Jimmy was from Coatbridge in Lanarkshire. Now I'll play a wee bit of Jimmy, and you can read the story there. Jimmy was a bit of a character. In 1985, I think it was, there was a Hungarian week in Glasgow. And part of that, they had 2 cymbalum players, and they played in the Glasgow City Chambers. And I got tickets, a couple of tickets, so I took Jimmy along to see the cymbalum players. And he was well impressed. But at the interval, everybody went into the next room for a cup of tea and a sandwich or whatever. And Jimmy said, "I want to have a look at these instruments." So he went up and he sat down at one of the cymbalums, and he took out his cane hammers, the same as the ones I was showing you earlier. And he took them out and he started finding out where the notes were. And then he started playing "I Belong to Glasgow," "The Northern Lights of Aberdeen." And people were coming back in and sitting down, and gave him a round of applause. And then there was a young man came in, and he said, "You're welcome to play the instrument at the end of the night, but we're a bit concerned you knock it out of tune. Would you mind not playing anymore?" And Jimmy stood up and he said, "That's fine, son. I've just fulfilled my life's ambition." And he got a big round of applause, and I'm sure that young man was wishing the ground could swallow him up. In the second half, he fell asleep and Levy's sat with his head against my shoulder, snoring. Frank and Willie Brown. Frank and Willie were two brothers that lived in Rutherglen. And well, I'll let you read the story there. That's another example of the type of music that they played in the Dulcimer group, because they loved these tunes. That was one of the favourite tunes. They always played that when they got together. And Frank and Willie, I used to sometimes give them a lift home with their dulcimers from the People's Palace, because Rutherglen was on my way home anyway. And they always got me to drop them off at the corner of the road. They wouldn't let me take them into the street and drop them off at their house. They always get dropped off. And every time I dropped them off, I'd say, I'll take you around. It's only, no, we're fine here. And it was about a year before I found out the reason for that was that they were going to the pub. They were taking their dulcimers to the pub to have a wee session, a wee tune and play. But they obviously didn't want me to go with them. Or they certainly weren't inviting me anyway. The next one is just some photographs of the group. And when we started meeting initially, the People's Palace has a big glass conservatory on the back, the winter garden, and that was closed for a long time because the roof was unsafe. But eventually, 1985, they had repaired the roof and they were able to open the winter garden. And that's the People's Palace with the winter garden on the back. So we were able to move into that, and it was a much better place to play. We could all sit in a big semicircle or spread out. And this is a couple of, well, this is, the sort of core of the group. The people sitting playing here, Nan Kirkpatrick, the lady on the left, she was a retired school teacher and she played the piano, and I think her father had played the dulcimer and she had decided to take it up, and she came along to the dulcimer group, and Jimmy MacDonald and some of the others were helping her to learn to play. John Crichton there, and Jim Barr sitting at the end beside John Crichton had been making dulcimers. They got a set of plans and they had made a few, and on the photograph on the right, that's Jim closest to us with one of his dulcimers. And he would make them and string them up, and then John Crichton would take them away and tune them for him. Andy Fagan was another. Andy had the dulcimer probably from 1915, 1916 or something like that. And again, he played in the family band. He got the job of being the dulcimer player. He said his hands were too small to play the fiddle. And Jenny Coxon actually did an interview with Andy. Or rather, the Dulcimer group did an interview with Andy, and Jenny Coxon transcribed it for us. And it was published in the Nonsuch newsletter, but I'll come to that later on. I'd like to hear a bit of Andy's playing. Andy had actually stopped playing the dulcimer in the 1950s. He also played the accordion, and he's still playing that. But when he was, I think, 67, he was invited to Canada to his niece's wedding, and he decided he wanted to learn the bagpipes to go, and he did. He learned the bagpipes to go and play at the wedding. And when he came back, he gave it was the pipe major of the Glasgow Police pipe band that had been teaching him. And when he gave him the bagpipes back, he told Andy to keep them and conditioned that he would teach the Boys Brigade the pipes. So he became a tutor for the Boys Brigade. And he wrote a march for the Boys Brigade centenary, which was played at the celebrations. Back to John Crichton again. This is him playing one of Jim Barr's dulcimers. This is just a photograph to let you see a bit more of what the environment was like in the People's Palace for people sitting playing. And it was nice. Eventually, they opened up a cafe, and they had a seated area for people to come in there, and that made it a lot more of the public came in and listened to the music and came over and chatted to the musicians, and it was good. The group went on for quite a long time, but unfortunately, my job, I had to work a lot of Saturdays, so from about 1988 onwards, I think I was very seldom in. We had quite a few concerts for the dulcimer group in different locations. These ones were in the People's Palace, and this was Willie Burke, John Crichton, and I don't know who the accordionist was, but they had played in the 60s and the 70s as the Uddingsonians. And I've included this here so we can hear the difference between the Uddingsonians and the Ray family from Northern Ireland. And the Ray family from Northern Ireland they were related to John Ray, and I'm sure some of you have heard some of John Ray's recordings. And quite remarkably, the dulcimers were modelled on John's, but they actually sound very like listening to John's playing as well. Yeah, I think the older, I think it was George and David were the two brothers, and I think George Senior was a cousin of John Ray's, but they referred to him as Uncle John, and this was a tune that they'd learned from Uncle John. And this was the finale at that concert with the Ray family and the Glasgow Dulcimer group. As I say, we did have quite a few concerts, and one of the concerts we had was Heather Corbett was the guest. Heather plays the cymbalum, and she had a pianist to accompany her, and she had somebody to turn her music for her, and it cost us a fortune. But it was on the condition that we didn't record it, so we don't have any recordings from the concert, or photographs for that matter. But another one was with Jim Cusa as the main guest, and I'm sure a few of you will be familiar with Jim. But unfortunately, I don't have any recordings of Jim playing. I don't have any recordings from this concert except for myself and Maggie McInnes on the clarinet. So I can play a wee bit of that. And that was the finale, which unfortunately wasn't recorded either at that concert. There were two other musicians played at that. Willie Burke and John Crichton played, but they wouldn't stay long enough for the finale. They were away to the pub. I mentioned Andy Fagan. I mentioned Jenny Coxon transcribing Andy's interview, and a very significant thing that Andy said: every second or third house he went to in Coatbridge, Bells Hill, Motherwell, all miners with no radio in these days. And of course, if they didn't play a melodeon or a mouth organ, they'd play the dulcimer. Part of the significance of that is at the start of this, I said that I'd been asked to do a talk on the Glasgow tradition, but as I started to look through the newspaper archives, it became clear that it wasn't just a Glasgow tradition, it was throughout Scotland. But if you include Lanarkshire and Greater Glasgow, then I would say that is the Glasgow tradition, because it continued much longer in Glasgow and Lanarkshire than it did in the rest of the country. Lanarkshire in particular, anytime I've played at weddings or functions in Lanarkshire in particular, I still get people even up to a couple of years ago telling me that their grandfather or great uncle played the dulcimer. So I think in Lanarkshire it probably was the most popular place for it. But if you include that as Greater Glasgow, then certainly it could be the Glasgow tradition. But there's a couple other, Ayrshire as well. Ayrshire was a big mining place, big mining communities there. And, I had one story about Ayrshire being Robert Burns, but there is another one that came to mind. And this one is in relation to football, junior football. Now, junior football is not age related, it's just as opposed to professional football. And junior football leagues were very popular with miners and mining communities. And this story is about a team called Glenbuck Cherry Pickers. Now, Glenbuck was where Bill Shankly came from, who went on to become Liverpool manager, very famous. And this was his nephew, Roger Hines, was also a football player. And he was being interviewed on television after Bill Shankly had died. And he talked about the Glenbuck Cherry Pickers being a junior team who had actually produced a high number of professional players. And then he quoted a story where Glenbuck Cherry Pickers were playing Ardeer, which is another place in Ayrshire, and Ardeer had brought along with them a band as well as their supporters. And then it says, as usual, in the second half in junior football, a fight broke out, which resulted in the crowd and the band mobbing the pitch, with the result, one of the Glenbuck Cherry Pickers was battered with a dulcimer. So that's, I don't know whether to include that as the dulcimer in football or the dulcimer in Ayrshire. But that brings us to the end.